Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. The US Secretary of War says a US submarine has sunk an Iranian warship in the Indian Ocean. The state funeral for Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei is postponed as reports suggest his son could replace him. And Asian stock markets tumble as the conflict enters its fifth day. A US submarine has sunk an Iranian warship with a torpedo in the Indian Ocean. US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth made the announcement earlier today, but did not name the Iranian ship that was attacked. Meanwhile, Turkish officials say a missile launched from Iran that was heading towards a Turkish airspace has been destroyed by NATO air defense systems. For more on this, I'm joined by Raghida Dergham, advisor on US and international affairs.
Dergham.
Dergham, thank you so much. Sorry, I do apologise. Raghida, nice to have you on the show as always. I just want to begin with the fact that the US military says it's carried out over 2,000 strikes on Iran since Saturday. Meanwhile, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the UAE were targeted by Iranian airstrikes overnight. Where do things stand right now on the fifth day of fighting?
Well, we are expecting what they're calling now in Washington the overwhelming part of the military operation, an obliteration, basically, because they are going to use, or they started to use the B-2 bombers, but they're going to use much more sophisticated ways to destroy the infrastructure, the military infrastructure of Iran. And so they are thinking that they could complete this in a few days. The equation is very tough on Iran because there will be no airspace controlled by Iran. They will lose the control of it, and therefore they are going to be on the receiving end. I think the Iranians are aware of this, the Iranian regime, that is. And I think it's going to be quite a turning point in the next few days.
And it's really interesting because we heard from Pete Hegseth earlier, and he says this was never meant to be a fair fight, and it's not a fair fight. We are punching them while they are down. But despite the Iranian military taking an absolute hammering by US-Israeli strikes, they've still managed to attack tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. What impact is this conflict having on the energy industry in the region?
All right, I'll discuss the energy industry in a second, but I just think the ability, the capability of Iran to continue to do that is now severed. It will be severed further because, of course, the Navy is destroyed totally, and the communication system is going to be down totally in a few days, as I said, in a day or two. Therefore, I don't think the Iranians are going to be able to launch impactful revenge operations, neither towards the Gulf states nor anywhere else, nor through the proxies for that matter. As to the energy situation, look at China, what China is doing right now. It's going to Saudi Arabia to, I think, not only say, listen, we're not going to side with Iran in this conflict militarily, but to also say, we need oil. We need your oil because China needs Middle Eastern oil, not Russian oil at this point in 2 weeks. So that's the sort of considerations that are taking place. So energy is important, but it's strategically important as well. And it's also apparently, countries change positions, knowing that there is a strategic pact between China and Iran, which is now, as it looks, just on paper.
So earlier, we were just talking about Iran's ability to be able to continue its interference in the Strait of Hormuz, the fact that their Navy capability will be obliterated and the next few days of this conflict could be a game changer. In your opinion, what do Iran do right now? What do their leadership do? Because they do not want to lie down, do they?
No, they're not willing to surrender. They made that very clear. I don't really know what they have in mind in terms of the old structure of the regime. I mean, of course, the Revolutionary Guards are no longer the revolutionary guards of the past. Maybe the military could play a role. Maybe the Iranian military would be in a position to save whatever is possible in Iran, because I mean it's also being sought by the United States, at least in its totality, or at least if there is a part of it that is willing to make a sort of a Venezuela transition, which is not the full collapse of the regime, but the full collapse, for example, of the old guards of the regime, leadership and revolutionary guards. So, and then there is, as you know, there is talk about what's next and who's going to be willing to work on the ground. We know of Kurdish. We hear that the US is trying to and see what the Kurdish components can do on the ground. And they are powerful, and they could be one of the components. But I think that right now the preoccupation of the United States is with the military action. In parallel, of course, there is the search of how to make the transition. NATO countries are taking a very interesting position now in the sense that they're keeping an eye on Turkey, but they're keeping an eye on the EU is keeping an eye on Cyprus in particular, because as you know, Iran has been attacking Cyprus too. So the situation, if they launch any bigger attack on Cyprus, then the EU will have to take a different position. All of that impacts energy, and I don't think the Iranians have the capacity to keep the Hormuz Straits closed for too long.
It's so interesting, you just talking to me about the widening of this conflict and other countries that could possibly be drawn into this. Raghida, as always, thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
For more on this, I'm joined by a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and former Senior Advisor to the US Envoy to Iran, Len Khodorkovsky. Len, thank you so much for joining me. So we're just speaking to Raghida then. She was outlining the fifth day of military action. But Pete Hegseth has said Iran is toast, and they know it, as the war, of course, enters its fifth day and Iran's retaliatory strikes continue on neighboring countries. Do you agree with the Secretary of War that Iran's toast?
Thanks for having me back on, Leigh-Ann. And what I do agree with is that it is not a fair fight, nor should it be a fair fight. I think the United States will accomplish its military objectives to dismantle the regime layer by layer until it can no longer threaten the United States, our friends, or our interests. And that is the military objective. And then the big decision will be what comes next. And I think what the situation calls for is a steady, credible transition to hopefully a future unthreatening and reliable and democratic Iran.
And it's really interesting because we talk about transition, and this has been a lot of the talk. What comes next? When does the US say we've completed military action in Iran alongside Israel, and they try to get to some sort of diplomatic solution? Can you envision that in the future, that there will be a diplomatic off-ramp? Or do you think that it's military attacks that can change the game in Iran?
Well, I think there will have to be a diplomatic solution. Military is one tool of diplomacy. It's the tool of last resort. But at the end of the day, people will have to talk and decisions will have to be made diplomatically, because Iran will have to rejoin the international community. And that will require a framework that works, for Iran, that works for the entire region, and that works for the United States as well. So at the end of the day, the military will accomplish a certain objective, and the conversation will start on what happens next and how to ensure that the investment of all of these resources and lives would have been worth it. And I think the only way it would be worth it is if what replaced this regime was a normal government that can be neighborly, that can work with the world, that is not threatening, and is interested in collaboration and partnerships that are productive. I think that's the objective, and I believe that is from where I can see, there's really only one credible candidate for something like that, and that's the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. He doesn't have the baggage of being associated with the regime. He certainly has the support of millions of Iranians who just chanting his name during the latest set of protests. I haven't heard any other names that were chanted or hinted at. And I believe he can also rally the remnants of the regime, the military and the bureaucratic apparatus that doesn't have blood on its hands. So I do think there's a way out, and I'm sure the conversations are taking place. And sooner rather than later, we are going to transition to the next phase.
And it's really interesting you talking to me about Reza Pahlavi, but I just want to say what Donald Trump actually said yesterday. Trump says most new Iran leaders eyed by the US are dead. And as we know, right now in Iran, they are holding these special assemblies to elect a new supreme leader. But Len, I want to move on because social media users are widely sharing old tweets from President Donald Trump. In 2013, he tweeted, "Now that Obama's poll numbers are in a tailspin, watch for him to launch a strike in Libya or Iran. He's desperate." And many people out there are asking why the hypocrisy from the US president, because he vowed to be the president of no forever wars, and he also criticized Biden quite heavily over Iran.
I think it's a fair question, and I think the answer is actually pretty clear. First of all, no one should compare President Trump to President Obama or Biden. There's a world of difference between them. President Trump is a decisive leader who is looking out for the interests of the American public, as he should. That is his constitutional obligation. What I would describe this particular operation being is not a forever war. It is a discrete action to protect the American people from nearly 50 years of threats from the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. And he is doing what no other president has done, which is at long last, finally, deal with a core issue. He's dealing with that issue. He is dismantling this regime. He is setting the conditions for the country of Iran to reinvent itself. And in that way, the region to reinvent itself, because everyone in the region knows that as long as this regime is in place, there is no peace in the region. It is the most expansive, invasive, parasitic entity that has meddled in, probably a handful of countries in the region, certainly Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq, and just about it's fired at various countries. I have to tell you from experience, when I was at the State Department, I had multiple conversations with various diplomats from the region. And what they told me is, if you'd asked me, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, who our biggest enemy is, I would say the I word, Israel. But as of today, our biggest enemy is the other I word, it's Iran. They said Israel hasn't killed any of our people, whereas Iran has killed many of our people. And that is, I think, what you're seeing play out right now. No one is going to cry for the Ayatollah, and no one is going to believe that Ayatollah Jr. is some sort of a Jeffersonian Democrat. So I think all the leaders in the region are certainly they should defend themselves, and they should do everything possible to defend their citizens from the regime's indiscriminate firing in their civilian structures, hotels, homes, and other areas, which again underscores the malevolence of this regime. But at the end of the day, the United States will take care of business and there will be a new day.
So, Len, I just want to put something to you. In an interview with Al Arabiya, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman said we are defending ourselves and not attacking neighboring countries, adding that Tehran is targeting sites attacking Iran. Do they have the right to defend themselves? Because they say that they didn't start this war.
I would disagree with that. I think they started this war almost 50 years ago. Just count the bodies that lay in the wake of this regime. They've been at war with the world as long as they've existed. They are responsible for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of deaths and casualties around the world. We're not even talking about their own people. They've massacred, 40,000 or so of Iranian citizens just a few weeks ago. And I can tell you that they're responsible for thousands of American deaths. They have blood on their hands. So they've been at war. So, with respect, actually with disrespect to the foreign minister, I would say if his regime behaved like a normal state from the inception, we wouldn't be sitting here and talking about the regime defending itself. Nor would I classify firing missiles at hotels and homes as defending themselves. It's indiscriminate firing at civilian infrastructure, which we know if the regime doesn't care about its own people, it certainly doesn't care about the people living in the neighboring countries.
Len Khodorkovsky, really good to have your analysis. As always, thank you.
Thanks so much.
For more on this, I'm joined by James Sunderland, former British Conservative MP and retired Army commander. James, a pleasure to have you on the show with me this evening. So you've worked across the Middle East, James, during your career. How long is this conflict likely to last? Pete Hegseth says 6 weeks, 4 weeks or less. What's your conclusion? Because we have had so many different thoughts on this.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me onto your show. I have spent a lot of time in the Middle East over the years. I've worked in countries like Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan, UAE, Oman, Qatar, and more recently Saudi Arabia. But despite my experience in the region, doesn't make me qualified to give you an informed answer on how long this conflict might last for. I think what's striking so far is the nature of the surprise. I think what's striking as well is the lack of clarity on what the US and Israeli war aims are. And I think the degree of uncertainty as well with regards to how long this will last for and what the impact will be across the whole region is yet to be determined. So I think all bets are off.
Yeah, it's absolutely interesting, especially the conflicting reports coming from Benjamin Netanyahu, Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth. But let's touch more on what Pete Hegseth had to say earlier. He spoke about the US submarine, which sunk an Iranian warship earlier today. Is the US right in its tactics to punch Iran while they are down right now? Or will this only show strength? What will this do?
Well, again, it's interesting because if you look at the prosecution of the military campaign, that should give us some clues as to what the strategic aims are. Now, if the aim is regime change, then that's fine, but they would be going after individuals and those agencies of state that allow the regime to be propped up. But if they're going after nuclear sites, if they're going after Navy targets, if they're going after air defense sites, it clearly strikes me that those aims are much broader. And it does seem at this point in time as though the US and Israel are digging in for a longer, broader, more protracted conflict. And the fact that the US has sunk so many Iranian ships and hit so many Iranian targets would appear to suggest that this is a medium to longer term event.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the US said today it sunk 20 Iranian ships, and the US has struck 2,000 different sites in Iran. So we're getting more and more detail of that military coordinated action happening. But we've seen cracks appear in the so-called special relationship we all talk about between the US and the UK. There's lots of questions going on at the moment. We are now hearing the HMS Dragon will not reach Cyprus until next week. Do you feel Keir Starmer has made the right call in not joining Trump's war? Because Donald Trump was scathing yesterday in that White House conference he held with the German Chancellor, saying we're not dealing with Winston Churchill. It was a real body blow to Starmer.
Yeah, there's many elements to your question, and I'll try and unpick them if I can, one by one. I think the first thing that I would say is that the special relationship between the US and the UK is real. I've served in the British military for a long time. I've worked alongside US troops. I have been to Washington on many occasions as a politician. And there's no doubt at all that that relationship is steeped in history. You can go back to Reagan and Thatcher, you can go back to Clinton and Blair, and the list goes on. I think right now, at this point in time, that relationship is at a pretty low ebb, but that's at government level. So at the tactical, at the strategic level, military level, I suspect that the relationship is as fruitful as it's always been, exchange of information, working side by side as coalition partners. But quite clearly, what's happened in the media over the last 2 days has cast that in doubt. In respect of Keir Starmer, you know, I'm not a Labour politician. I'm a Conservative politician. So you would expect me to criticise the Prime Minister. But actually, I think the Prime Minister, given UK interests in the region and given the number of British people in that part of the world, and given our very close relationship with many Arab nations who've been fantastic allies to the UK over many years, I think he was probably right just to pause and to think about it. And this is not just about joining a military campaign where it would have been easy to deploy aircraft and missiles and to hit Iranian targets. This is also about the second and the third order effects. So while I'm not in any way condoning the delay and the criticism that Donald Trump has given to Keir Starmer, I do think it's worth reflecting on the fact that the Prime Minister is a lawyer and he would have wanted to be sure before he joined a campaign where offensive action was being taken.
James Sunderland, good point there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
I do apologise. We're going to start with the death toll in Iran from the US-Israeli attacks has risen to 1,045 people. That's according to Iran's semi-official Tasman news agency. The state funeral for Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who was killed at the weekend, has been postponed. Meanwhile, Iran's reportedly close to a decision on appointing a new leader. One of the frontrunners is Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei. For more on this, I'm joined by Hamzah Rifaat, president of Future Initiatives, a think tank in Pakistan. It's a great pleasure to have you on, Hamzah. Thank you so much for joining me. So, loud explosions have been heard across Tehran as Israel announces broad-scale strikes. Due to the continued military activity, when is the Assembly of Experts scheduled to meet to select Iran's new supreme leader?
Well, thank you so much. I think it's very hard to say. I think in the near term, to actually appoint the supreme leader, there's a certain process which actually goes through it. But given that the situation in Iran is considerably dangerous, there have been attacks on different cities and different hospitals. And we need to understand that Mujtaba Khamenei has also been the target of an assassination attempt in Iran. So there is a situation where it has to be done in the near term. There are two ways to look at it. First of all, Iran needs to make sure that this process is expedited, to make sure that, a signal goes to its adversaries, whether it's Israel or the United States, that there's continuity with regard to the regime. And at the other in the other way, it's also important to ensure that needs to be, when you look at the supreme leader in general, his security, his presence in Iran is incredibly precarious at the same time. He's already survived an assassination attempt. Israel could attempt it again. So there is a situation where the Tehran and the supreme leaders need to ensure, and the council as well, as to how to make sure that the candidate Mujtaba Khamenei is secure. Number two, how to project as if to say the regime is pretty much consistent to the outside world. So it needs to have a delicate balance, but it's very difficult to ascertain as to whether this process could take weeks or it would be in the immediate future.
And let's talk a little bit about who you've been mentioning there, Mujtaba Khamenei, the front runner to really take over as the supreme leader. And if elected, will he maintain this hardline conservative control? Because this is the big question lots of people are asking. What is the US and Israel's point to this war? What do they want to achieve? And I'm sure they will be thinking not another conservative hardliner.
Yeah, that's true, but the US and Israel can wish whatever they want. The problem is that Mujtaba Khamenei is very close to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has been designated recently by the European Union as a terrorist organization. So he is going to adopt a hardline conservative approach. He's been very close to the IRGC. And obviously with the regional dynamics in Iran being constantly bombarded, we will see a very conservative, you could say nationalist, hyper-nationalist, hyper-religiosity orientation from Mujtaba Khamenei, which is not good for Iran, because that would indicate an expansionist foreign policy. Obviously, Iran attacking different ports all across the Middle East, whether it's, and also airports as well, and attacking civilian infrastructure, that clearly indicates that Iran is going ahead with misguided firing. I mean, targeting US bases is one thing, but when you're going to attack civilian infrastructure, that is considered to be a red line. So Mujtaba Khamenei is expected to adopt the same sort of policy making that his father or his predecessor has actually adopted, which doesn't bode well for regional security, because there's a lot of conspiracy theories, there's a lot of skepticism with regard to how Iran is going to approach the Israel and the American issue. But the fact remains that it's going to be a very conservative hardline approach, because that, according to Iran, would ensure continuity. It would ensure that, they would not necessarily back down, and it would ensure that their standard modus operandi at this point in time, which is, reckless adventurism, will continue regardless of the threats that they face.
And it's so interesting because you talk about this reckless adventure that Iran's been on. Why do you think that's been the case? Do you think it's because there's been this massive power vacuum in Iran since Ali Khamenei was assassinated during those attacks from the US and Israel? Do you think they're in panic mode?
Absolutely. You do see the inner circle, obviously, with regard to the Supreme Council of Leaders, and obviously the Assembly of Experts as well, to try and make sure that there's a peaceful transition in Iran. But the fact remains that it is not a peaceful transition anymore, because the inner core of that particular circle in Tehran continues to be fragmented. There's not a lot of consensus as to how to go ahead. They also want to prevent Raza Pahlavi, who they consider to be an American agent, from returning to Iran and being part of politics. But for that to materialize, it's really important for the regime to maintain continuity. And with regard to the inner, you could say, experts circle, there's not a lot of consensus with regard to how this transition would actually take place. And obviously with the casualty toll mounting and Iran being subject to consistent bombardment, you do see a power vacuum which could be exploited by non-state actors, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether it's the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and we've seen that given Israel's bombardment of Lebanon as well. So there is a panic. I do agree with you. There is a lot of panic. There's not a lot of consistency with regard to how this transition takes place. But for Iran to have some sort of face-saving in this entire regional quagmire, it's important to make sure that consistency is maintained.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating talking about, because it's very difficult, of course, to analyse the situation exactly in Iran because we don't get very clear information out of the country, as our viewers know. But I just want to talk a little bit more about the threat of Israel. Israel says it's intended to target Iran's next supreme leader, regardless of who is appointed. How dangerous is this rhetoric right now? And say we get a new supreme leader and Israel does manage to target them, that's just going to be absolute devastation for the country.
It will be very devastating. There's one thing that Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich comes up with comments and rhetoric, and there's one thing coming from the Israeli occupation forces, or it's coming from Benjamin Netanyahu himself. And it's quite clear that any sort of Iranian leader who is perceived to be very close to the IRGC, who's going to adopt a hard-line conservative approach, which Mustafa Khamenei, by the way, will adopt if he does come into power, that would result in Israel considering, and I'm saying this in quotation marks, considering Iran to pose an existential threat, which would mean more bombardments. And we need to understand that Mustafa Khamenei has already survived an assassination attempt. So there's something, something similar could definitely take place, because Israel has basically decided that they want to depose the regime. Any sort of sympathizers or any sort of, you could say, dispensation, which is closer to the regime and less closer to figureheads such as Raza Pahlavi, would be considered to be a threat by Mossad and by the Israeli occupation forces, as well as by Netanyahu himself. So there is definitely a possibility, is an existential threat that Mustafa Khamenei, God forbid, could actually be taken out by the Israeli forces. But for that to actually materialize, Israel needs to, there are costs to pay. Obviously, Iran is in a state of mourning, and for something, a repetition of what happened to Khamenei actually taking place, that is something that could really embolden Iran to continue with its reckless adventurism.
Hamzah, it's been absolutely fascinating to have you on the show. Hamzah Rifaat, thank you so much for your insights. For more on this, I'm joined by British-Iranian activist and actress Elika Ashoori, who's also the daughter of Anoosheh Ashoori, who was imprisoned in Iran. Elika, as the war enters its fifth day, Iranian state media is reporting the death toll from US-Israeli attacks on Iran has risen to 1,145 people. As someone who lived in Iran under the supreme leader and whose father was held hostage for 5 years in the country, right now, how are you feeling?
I think I speak on behalf of myself and many Iranians when I say that we're going through a mixture of emotions of heartbreak, but also feeling, exasperated feelings of what is to come next. And it's a very difficult time for the people of Iran, but we must not also forget that this war didn't start for the people of Iran 2 days ago or 6 months ago or last year. The people of Iran have been actively fighting this regime since its conception in 1979. And we have seen that time and again in the protests in 2009, 2022, and even in the latest protests where people out of pure exhaustion, exasperation, went to the streets unarmed and were massacred by this regime. So this is not something new to Iran at all. And we have to, in order to answer the questions of what comes next, we have to really reflect back on what was said and what was ignored up to this point.
And what is your reaction to President Donald Trump's statement urging Iranians to take over your government following the US and Israeli strikes? Because when you were talking to me, you were talking about those anti-government protests that we did see happen earlier this year.
We have seen that the Iranians have tried to do that time and again, as I said, without weapons, and are faced with a firing squad. They have been killed, and we have seen in clips on social media where a truck runs over masses of people, groups of people, and children as young as 3 years old were shot in the head and killed in these protests. So this rhetoric of go and take back your freedom is a bit ludicrous, because people have started, people have tried to do this time and again, but it is up to the Western powers, not through war, but through diplomatic means, to have suffocated this regime before it escalated to this stage. People, the European Union, UK, they continue to validate this regime. They continue to give them a voice on a political stage. And for what? The Islamic regime chaired the UN Assembly of Human Rights. And we're talking about a country that has made it legal for girls as young as 9 to get married. So we're talking about a regime that massacred its people and then charged a bullet fee to give the bodies back to their loved ones. So by emboldening them, we have allowed them to fester and infect Europe and globally their ideology. And it's going to be that much more complicated now to remedy that.
And Elika, have you heard from Iranians inside of the country as the US says more forces are arriving? Do you know if people are trying to flee for safety? Have you heard from anybody?
Connection, as you know, has been extremely difficult. There's been a total internet blackout. I managed to talk to a friend 2 days ago when it all started and before the internet was completely shut down. And she told me that she was feeling a mixture of numbness, horror, loss, and hope. So these are really strange, combinations of feelings to feel at the same time. And I don't blame them. I don't think people in Iran feeling relief of the death of Khamenei, who was a tyrannical dictator, is from bloodlust, is from relief, is from relief from years of being suppressed. I don't know any Iranian who doesn't know a loved one or a family member who hasn't experienced loss. And I think each Iranian is now plagued with this conflict of feelings as to what they should feel and how this would progress.
And Elika, right now, the US says it's winning against Iran and they can fight as long as needed. What message would you give to Iranians inside Iran who are facing both repression and the impacts of the war?
I would like to send them my sincere respect. I know that it's extremely terrifying to still stand and protest against this regime despite whatever has gone on. And I really hope that they will get the agency and the freedom that has been so well deserved and that they've so been longing for, so that they can come together and create a democratically elected Iran where people can have a voice and people can have a chance at a normal life.
Elika Ashoori, as always, it's really good to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
A reminder of our top stories. The US Secretary of War says a US submarine has sunk an Iranian warship in the Indian Ocean. The state funeral for Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei is postponed as reports suggest his son could replace him. And Asian stock markets tumble as the conflict enters its 5th day. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Of course, follow us on X+. We'll be back in a couple of hours with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you for watching.